Chapter 3. Reki stood by the massive cargo bay hatch. The 3 meters that separated her from the containers made the room suddenly feel claustrophobic. Getting in, Zilf thought, second most dangerous part of the op. Yuri initiated a private channel. Zilf accepted and said, "Aren't we supposed to be working?"
What if she opens that door and there's just space?
Zilf terminated the connection without a word and shivered. Any time spent in freefall, with nothing to ultimately land on, was one of his absolute fears. Being exposed with no ocean floor to descend to, no firm ground just a few hundred meters away, made his blood freeze. Which, of course, Yuri knew. "Asshole," Zilf muttered. Reki's voice filled the comms.
Mission starts now, Wreckers.
And the klaxon blared. A warning light flashed across his HUD. Bay purging, with a counter next to it. The counter ticked off from 5 to 1, the word purging filling the HUD. Zilf watched the oxygen in the bay disappear with flecks of skin debris or whatever else the team had tracked inside since it was last opened to vacuum. He closed his eyes, although the cargo bay's flashing warning lights penetrated his eyelids to pulse like a beating heart. "Opening," Reki said. A low chime, just loud enough to hear, repeated 3 times. After a moment, it returned a little louder and a little more noxious.
Look at that!
Li Zhao called out.
Just beautiful!
Zilf hesitantly blinked open his eyes and found himself staring into a cavernous space. Lights flicked on, bright enough to trip his visor's filters. The crawler was as Spartan as it could be. No frills, such as a personnel cabin or a snack station. The corrugated steel and alloy was exposed rather than covered in safety fabric. Without the lights, it would be black as pitch. Despite its utilitarian construction, it did have 10 EPBs, emergency personnel bubbles, along one bulkhead, while several recessed emergency power and oxygen stations lined the other. He guessed Shensho had decided it wasn't important to make it comfortable. If you were going down, you were going down for work.
No atmosphere, team,
Reki said.
So don't think about taking off your helmets.
Griggs snickered over the mic, but said nothing. Zilf turned to his suit's container, activated the mag lifts, and the massive steel box rose 2 centimeters from the deck. He turned again to face the lift, took a deep breath, and began a careful, steady walk inside the car. Suits followed him like an eager puppy, or maybe a stalking cat. As long as he walked at a constant pace and slowed carefully, the container couldn't possibly bump into him. At least, that was the theory. Using his rear cam, he ensured the container wouldn't clip the car as he guided it inside. No problem. He was as flush as he could be. Zilf carefully slowed his pace as he reached the rear of the car, the container matching him centimeter per centimeter. By the time he halted, with nearly 2 meters of space between the bulkhead and the container, his steps had become little more than nudges of his boots. After deactivating the mag lifts and activating the magnetic clamps, he walked around the container to stand beside the bulkhead with the emergency equipment. It took a little more than 4 minutes for the rest of the team to park their containers. Reki walked inside the car and typed on their jump ship's cargo bay keypad. A tone sounded over their comms.
Wreckers ready to drop.
Wilkes' voice came back immediately.
Shit in the shop,
he replied. The airlock connecting the car to the ship began closing, the artificial light bathing their cargo bay disappearing. A vibration stuttered against his toes, the impact tremor of tons of steel striking more tons of steel.
I wait tales of your adventures,
Wilkes said. He sounded amused, but at the same time a little tight. Wilkes was a last-minute replacement pilot, and Zilf hadn't yet figured him out. Li Zhao harumphed.
You're just going to spend the next several hours in a porn hollow. Probably,
Wilkes said.
That's my job, isn't it? Good luck, Wreckers.
Reki, obviously doing her best not to laugh, said,
That's it, people. I'm going to activate the lift and then we'll see what we see. Hopefully a better view than this tin can,
Yuri said.
Shensho really skimped on this one. Are you talking bad about our employer?
Reki asked as she walked to the starboard bulkhead. Zilf just now made out the dimly lit recessed control station. Or had it been there all along, but its lights hadn't been working?
Because I'd have to report you to the loyalty police.
Yuri sucked in a breath.
Oh, please, not that. Boss?
Li Zhao asked.
How long are we going to be in this thing?
Reki was silent for a moment. A light flashed overhead, 3 times red, 2 times yellow, then finished with a single green flash that became steady. The deck beneath them rumbled. The distinct vibration of metal sliding against metal preceded a boom he heard through his feet. The overhead lights dimmed to nothing, and the bulkheads seemed to leave existence. What replaced them left him stunned. The lift rolled down a massive cable that spanned all the way to the planet's atmosphere. The blue nebula the rest of his crew had talked about covered a portion of the sky, delicate tendrils much like fingers, spreading out from the ethereal jewelry. He tried to speak, but nothing more than a croak left his throat. Zhao Tu, a white surface striated with random lines of rust, shined back at them with pallid light. Blue craters littered an area no doubt thousands of kilometers from the stations below them. The briefing hadn't told them enough about the atmosphere for him to have any idea how often the planet had been hit over the millennia. If the atmosphere was significant enough, most objects would burn up. If not, the planet was in a shooting gallery. The crawler descended faster. He sucked in a breath, daring himself to close his eyes. He wanted to. Oh, how he wanted to.
Hey, what's that?
Griggs asked. His cam feed appeared on Zilf's HUD. There was another platform some distance from theirs, a cable identical to the one they were on, but it had no crawler. Zilf followed the cable's position and its destination. It had to be less than 5 or 6 kilometers away from theirs.
Has to be another entrance to the complex,
Reki said. Zilf nodded. Guessing they didn't want us to confuse them?
Guess not,
Reki said. Microgravity disappeared as the crawler continued accelerating until it reached 10 Gs. Not exactly comfortable if you weren't wearing the proper gear, but for the EETs, it was nothing. Once you got used to the acceleration and the dampeners, it took a hell of a change for you to even notice. An altitude counter appeared on his HUD, but he was looking past it, still feasting his eyes on the blue nebula that was slowly fading away as they dropped through layer after layer of atmosphere. When it finally disappeared from view, he felt a little lost. So beautiful. The outposts, like Zhao Tu, didn't have the clutter of rings of nanosatellites bouncing ambient light everywhere. Nor did they suffer from the constant barrage of engine flares, spotlights, warning lights, and the like. Terrifying, yet beautiful just the same. Maybe on the way back up, he'd be a little more open-minded. He continued scanning the planet's horizons, looking for interesting geological details or other hints of topography. Rolling mountains that may once have been nothing more than waves before freezing beneath a dying star littered the planet's surface. Zhao Tu certainly looked as though it had always been water-covered, but that was no guarantee. Reki? Zilf asked. We got schematics yet?
We'll go over them after we land in the dock,
She said, not at all annoyed.
Dock? What's a dock?
Yuri asked. She shrugged.
Guess we'll see in a few minutes.
Details of the ground below them became more focused. Whereas before what he'd seen appeared more like blurs, he now saw distinct ice fractures, valleys, troughs, peaks, all of it. Zhao Tu was beautiful, and they were still dropping toward it at a suicidal speed. Hey, Reki, when does this thing start? Zilf had time to ask, before a new wave of harsh vibrations rattled through his feet. The car's lights slowly brightened as the planet's light became more and more wan. They must have been lowered into a crater, perhaps an artificial one. A moment later, he saw the far lip of the crater. From this perspective, it was impossible to guess at its circumference. Perhaps he'd been mistaking the lines of mountains in the distance. Perhaps this entire hemisphere was the crater. Sadly, the deck didn't show them a view of what was directly beneath them. The car rapidly decelerated.
Oh, I just love pulling 10 Gs in the morning.
Griggs said.
Don't we all?
Yuri said. Operation File Received appeared on Zilf's HUD. He used blinks to acknowledge the message. A document opened and a partially rendered schematic appeared.
This is what the geniuses have allowed us to see so far. We're dropping into a place called the dock. That leads to their QM bay. Once we get past it, we'll be heading to the personnel bays. Welfare check?
Li Zhao asked.
Welfare check.
Reki agreed.
We also have to find a certain researcher in Station 3, as well as retrieve all data in their research center.
Yuri sputtered over the mic.
2 EETs who can repair nuclear reactors, and you'll send us on a snatch and grab? I do as I'm told,
Reki said, a playful growl in her voice.
And so do you.
She sounded playful, but Sylph knew better. The growl was her warning that she was willing to take a little grousing, but to be careful. She'd only take so much. Yuri's only response was to mute himself. The schematics were for one floor. He found it damn difficult to believe the station was only large enough to require a single floor. He'd never seen one that tiny, and certainly not one that could hold more than 20 personnel. The lift's G-forces increased for a moment, his inertial dampening kicking in for just a hitch. A terrible grinding noise had started to vibrate through his feet. The lift suffered another stomach-lurching drop before catching itself.
That doesn't sound good,
Yuri said.
Shit maintenance.
Sounds like the grippers are getting a little dull, Sylph said. If this was the main lift for the stations beneath the ice, they wouldn't enjoy too many more trips before their primary way off the planet failed completely.
I'll add a note to the log,
Reki said quietly. Zilf knew from experience she was serious about that too. Shinsho would get a safety inspection report from her in addition to the operation report. Another standard policy. The lift paused for a moment, finally stopping its fall. The shock triggered his dampeners. If not for them, he would have had a concussion. Just as he was recovering, the lift dropped again, but at a much slower pace. The bulkheads faded out, and the ocean view poured in. They descended the dense ice covering the planet and in a chute that seemingly traveled into infinity. With the dying star the only object to cast significant light on the planet, and roughly a couple of 100 meters of ice blocking them from what little remained, the ocean was completely black except for a single visible cable hanging down from the ice. Its spine had millions of microlights, each casting bright white. He didn't know what he'd imagined the water to look like, but it was the purest blue he'd ever seen. He walked to the bulkhead and quickly scanned the visible horizon for any signs of life. He knew there wouldn't be any, but he couldn't stop himself. He'd always wanted another ocean to explore, but most were too inhospitable for life. This, however, seemed like something else entirely. The lift continued falling parallel to the lit-up guide cable. They continued falling, and a counter appeared. 100 meters below surface ice, 125 meters below surface ice. He felt the rise in G's once again as the lift accelerated. The counter began going by 50s, then 100s. It stayed at that speed for only a few seconds before the G-forces reversed as the car braked. The bright blue water lightened in color as if the hue were being drained away, slowly transforming into a strange shade that he didn't think existed in nature before more and more of the red spectrum invaded the palette. The watery red became brighter, seemingly every 25 meters.
The fuck is that about?
Yuri asked.
Self?
Li Xiao asked.
Any ideas?
He shook his head. Must be something in the water, or maybe something environmental? Grigg snorted.
If there's something in the water, doesn't that make it environmental?
No, Zilf said. If there's something in the water, it was either put there or it's because something below is causing the water's color, like a volcanic vent or a mineral deposit.
Oh,
Grigg said hollowly, probably thinking he could get in a cheap shot at Zilf, only to realize it was a losing battle. The red brightened to a bright primary as if it were the only color in the universe. The visible cable began flashing. A sign proclaimed, Zhao 2, Station 1. Property of Shinsho had been lovingly stamped below it, the Chinese characters glowing in a pleasant green. The bulkheads seemed to slide upward as their view disappeared. When the lift came to a stop, Zilf glanced at the altitude indicator. 2.112 kilometers below surface ice.
Okay, Wreckers,
Reki said.
The door is going to open in a second. Griggs and Zilf up front. Immediate clear and secure.
Copy, Zilf said, Griggs echoing him. Zilf took a deep breath. Space was far above him now, far above the layer of ice that separated him from a presumably inhospitable atmosphere and temperatures that made Pluto look warm. He hardly experienced claustrophobia anymore, not since his fourth mission suit fitting, but he was having it now. Only it wasn't the thought of the suit around him, or that only a few meters of steel separated him from water that would kill him in seconds. It was the thought that there was no way back to the surface, except for that failing lift. Not true, he reminded himself. You just have to know where to get on the other one. Yeah, he muttered, if it works. He walked to the lift airlock and crouched slightly on the balls of the elevated boots. Extending his right arm, he flexed his fingers. A plasma torch slid out of the thick collar around his arm, its barrel extending just past his armor-gloved fingers. Griggs had brought up his plasma rifle and stood at the other side of the hatch, knees bent and ready to clear. Another breath.
Now, now, now,
Reki said.